Evelyn Harrow had never imagined that a roof built for laughter would one day shelter only silence, yet the neglected saloon before her seemed to understand loneliness better than any person she had met in months. The weathered sign hanging from one rusted chain swayed with every breath of wind, creaking as though the building itself wished to warn her away. Every board carried scars left by seasons of rain, dust, and forgotten footsteps. Window panes clouded by decades refused to reveal anything beyond faint shadows, while tumbleweeds gathered against the porch, as though even nature believed the place belonged to yesterday. Still, she reached for the heavy door, wrapped both trembling hands around its iron handle, and pushed. The hinges groaned with a sound so deep that it echoed through the empty room like an old man waking from uneasy sleep. Dust rose in lazy clouds, sparkling wherever thin shafts of afternoon light slipped through cracked shutters. The stale scent of old oak, dried tobacco, smoke, and forgotten whiskey lingered in the air despite the years. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was simply the scent of lives that had once mattered. We have often noticed that abandoned places never truly become empty. They continue holding voices after the people are gone. They remember footsteps long after boots have turned to dust. Walls gather whispers, ceilings cradle laughter, and wooden floors preserve burdens too heavy for words. Evelyn stood quietly because she believed that truth. Her father had taught her that every handmade thing deserved the courtesy of being greeted before it was judged. She removed her bonnet and spoke softly into the silence. "I suppose we're both starting over." Only the wind answered. She walked slowly across the uneven floorboards, testing each step before placing her full weight upon it. Some planks bowed beneath her boots, while others remained stubbornly firm. A long mahogany bar stretched across the western side of the room, surprisingly untouched beneath its thick blanket of dust. Whoever had built it had cared deeply about their craft. Even hidden beneath neglect, carved vines curled along its edges with remarkable elegance. Her fingertips brushed the wood. Dust lifted into the air, revealing polished walnut beneath. Someone had loved this place once. That thought settled inside her more heavily than disappointment could have. Near the fireplace lay several broken chairs stacked carelessly together, while a faded piano leaned silently against the wall, missing 3 ivory keys. The mirrors behind the bar had cracked into countless silver fragments, reflecting pieces of her face instead of the whole woman. For a moment she scarcely recognized herself. The determined eyes belonged to someone stronger than the weary traveler standing inside that forgotten room. She smiled anyway. A person who had survived enough eventually learned to smile first and understand later. The upstairs staircase still stood despite its age. One careful step at a time, Evelyn climbed toward the second floor. Every stair protested beneath her weight, though none surrendered. The hallway above contained 6 guest rooms, each stripped nearly bare except for rusted bed frames, faded wallpaper, and curtains that fluttered whenever the breeze slipped through broken glass. The final room overlooked the entire valley. Standing beside its window, Evelyn saw Hollow Creek stretching beneath the afternoon sun. From that height she could count abandoned storefronts, the church steeple standing faithfully above them all, children carrying water from the creek, and smoke curling from only a handful of chimneys. The town looked tired, not ruined. There was a difference. Ruined places surrendered. Tired places simply waited for someone willing to believe in tomorrow. Her father had always insisted that the strongest timber came from trees that survived difficult winters. Perhaps towns were no different. She spent the remaining daylight opening windows one by one. Fresh mountain air chased stale silence from every room. Dust drifted outside like gray ghosts finally released. She swept until her shoulders burned, gathered shattered glass into old flour sacks she discovered in the pantry, and stacked broken furniture neatly rather than leaving it scattered. By sunset, the saloon remained abandoned, but it no longer felt forgotten. That distinction mattered. Her supper consisted of hard bread soaked in warm water, and the final slice of dried salt pork wrapped carefully inside cloth. She ate while sitting behind the old bar because it happened to be the cleanest surface she had uncovered. Outside, coyotes began singing across distant hills. Inside, quiet settled gently around her. Loneliness always sounded louder after sunset. She thought of her mother humming while baking cornbread, of her younger brother Thomas carving toy horses from cedar scraps before scarlet fever stole him away, and of her father patiently explaining that honest work could never truly disappear, because every careful hand left fingerprints upon the world. Those fingerprints surrounded her now. Every beam, every nail, every carefully fitted board, someone's labor remained, long after the laborer himself had vanished. She wondered who he had been, whether he had laughed loudly, whether he had worried over unpaid debts, whether he had dreamed his building would still stand decades later beneath another lonely soul seeking shelter. As darkness deepened, Evelyn carried an oil lamp through the lower floor, one final time, before retiring upstairs. Its soft amber glow danced across the walls, revealing faded paintings nearly hidden beneath soot. One portrayed cattle crossing a shallow river. Another showed a young soldier embracing his wife beneath an elm tree. Though damaged by smoke and moisture, both possessed surprising tenderness. This had never been merely a drinking house. It had been where celebrations began, grief was shared, bargains were sealed, songs were sung, and strangers became neighbors. Communities often revealed themselves most honestly in ordinary places. She paused beside the fireplace. Something about the stonework caught her attention. The chimney appeared older than the surrounding walls. The mortar differed slightly in color near its eastern edge, as though repairs had been made years after construction. She crouched beside it, holding the lamp closer. One stone protruded only a fraction farther than the others. Not enough to seem deliberate, just enough to stir curiosity. She pressed against it. Nothing happened. She smiled at herself. Perhaps exhaustion invited imagination. Perhaps tomorrow would explain what today merely hinted. She extinguished the lamp, climbed upstairs beneath the pale moonlight filtering through cracked windows, spread her blanket across the least damaged bed frame, and listened to the building settle around her. Old wood creaked. Wind whispered beneath the roof. Somewhere far below, a single dull thud echoed through the empty saloon. Her eyes opened instantly. She held her breath. Silence returned. Then another faint sound drifted upward. Not from outside, from somewhere within the walls themselves. Evelyn remained perfectly still, every sense sharpened by years of learning that unusual sounds often carried ordinary explanations. Yet something about this one resisted reason. It came again, softer this time, like wood shifting against wood somewhere deep inside the structure, rather than beneath it. She lit her oil lamp once more, and descended the staircase carefully, shielding the flame with her hand. Shadows stretched across the saloon floor, growing and shrinking with each cautious step she took. The room looked unchanged, but it no longer felt entirely empty. She circled the bar, inspected the fireplace, and paused beside the cracked mirrors. Nothing moved except the wavering light. Then another faint knock echoed through the room, not loud enough to frighten her away, only steady enough to invite her curiosity. Her father had often said that fear rushed toward noise, while wisdom walked quietly to meet it. Evelyn chose wisdom. She traced the walls with the lamp held close, studying every board, every nail, every patch where fresh timber did not quite match old craftsmanship. The eastern wall behind the bar drew her attention. Unlike the others, its planks bore fewer scratches, and the dust settled differently there, almost as though the surface had remained untouched while the years had weathered everything around it. She ran her fingers across the wood and felt a narrow seam nearly hidden beneath layers of grime. It was too straight to be natural, and too careful to be accidental. Someone had measured it. Someone had concealed it. Yet there was no handle, no hinge, no visible lock. She smiled despite herself. Whoever had built such a hiding place had expected people to stop looking after the first glance. She admired that kind of patience. Morning arrived with pale sunlight pouring through broken windows, washing the room in gentle gold. Evelyn forgot neither the strange sound nor the curious seam. After eating the last of her bread, she borrowed a pry bar from the abandoned blacksmith shop across the street, leaving 2 silver buttons she had removed from an old coat upon the anvil, because even unused tools deserved honest payment. By midday she returned and began cleaning the eastern wall with a damp cloth. Every stroke revealed more of the fine walnut beneath. Dust surrendered slowly, exposing carved trim unlike anything elsewhere in the building. Tiny leaves and twisting vines framed the suspicious section, details impossible to notice until years of neglect had been wiped away. Whoever had hidden this wall had also decorated it beautifully, trusting that beauty itself would become camouflage. Hours passed before she discovered a single brass peg disguised within the carving of an oak leaf. She pressed it gently. Somewhere inside the wall, a quiet click answered. She stepped backward. Nothing happened. She pressed again, this time holding it longer. Another click echoed, followed by the faint scrape of aged wood shifting against hidden tracks. The entire section moved scarcely the width of a finger. Evelyn's heart beat faster, not with greed, but with wonder. She set the lamp upon the counter, gripped the edge of the panel with both hands, and pulled. Dust burst outward in a gray cloud as the false wall slowly swung open. Behind it lay a narrow chamber scarcely wider than a hallway. The air smelled dry, untouched, almost sacred. Shelves lined both sides from floor to ceiling. Most stood empty except for scattered bottles wrapped in yellowed newspaper, a rusted revolver left inside its leather holster, and several wooden crates stamped with dates more than 30 years old. At the far end rested a cedar chest beneath a thick canvas cloth. Unlike everything else, the chest showed almost no decay. The cedar had protected itself remarkably well. She knelt before it, brushing away decades of dust. Its brass latch remained untarnished. No lock secured it. Whoever had hidden it must have believed the secret room itself offered sufficient protection. She lifted the lid slowly. Inside rested a carefully folded wool blanket, a silver pocket watch that had long since stopped ticking, a leather-bound journal, and a bundle of envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Resting upon them all lay a single handwritten note. The ink had browned with age, yet every word remained clear. It read simply, "To the first honest soul who finds this, what remains here was never meant to make one person wealthy. It was always meant to bring Hollow Creek home again." Evelyn read the sentence twice before lowering herself onto the dusty floor. There was no signature beneath the message, only those few lines, written by a hand both steady and deliberate. She untied the ribbon around the letters with extraordinary care. The first envelope bore the name Eleanor Whitcomb. Another carried the name Samuel Boone. Then came dozens more, each addressed to different families throughout Hollow Creek. Some surnames still appeared upon weathered storefronts outside. Others had vanished entirely from town. None of the envelopes had ever been opened. She stared at them in silence, wondering why farewell letters addressed to so many different people had been hidden instead of delivered. Beneath the letters rested the leather journal. Its cover had darkened with age, the edges softened by careful handling before someone sealed it away. When she opened the first page, elegant handwriting greeted her. "If these words are being read, then I was unable to keep my promise in person." Evelyn slowly turned the next page, feeling that she was no longer exploring an abandoned saloon. She had stepped quietly into another person's unfinished life. Outside, unnoticed by her, the afternoon bell of the little church rang across Hollow Creek, its sound drifting through broken windows and into the hidden chamber, where a voice from decades before had been waiting patiently for someone willing to listen. She carried the journal into the fading light, near the front window, where the last rays of the sun illuminated each yellowed page. The handwriting possessed the careful rhythm of a man who understood that every sentence might become his last. "My name is Gideon Mercer," the opening line began, "and if Providence has allowed these pages to survive when I could not, then perhaps the truth still has a chance to breathe." Evelyn repeated the name softly. It meant nothing to her, yet there was a weight behind it that made the room seem suddenly occupied. Gideon wrote of arriving in Hollow Creek 35 years earlier with little more than a wagon, a carpenter's chest, and a promise to his young wife that they would build something worth leaving behind. He described raising the saloon beam by beam with neighbors who believed communities were built not only by churches and schools, but also by places where weary travelers found warmth during long winters. He confessed that despite the bottles upon the shelves, he had insisted the kitchen remain open to hungry children and widows who could not afford a meal. Every Sunday afternoon, the tables became classrooms where older miners taught immigrant boys to read, while ranch wives exchanged recipes, quilts, and stories of distant homes. The building had never been only a saloon. It had been the town's second hearth. Evelyn turned each page slowly, hearing the voice of a man who refused bitterness, even when describing hardship. Then the journal changed. Gideon's handwriting grew heavier. He wrote of discovering silver in the northern hills, of wealthy investors arriving with polished boots and polished lies, of honest families persuaded to sell their land for a fraction of its worth. He recorded names, dates, contracts, and sums of money with remarkable precision. One name appeared more often than any other: Horace Bellamy. Evelyn frowned. The Bellamy family still owned the largest general store in Hollow Creek. The current proprietor, Alden Bellamy, often spoke proudly of his grandfather's success. Yet Gideon's account painted another picture entirely. According to the journal, Horace Bellamy had forged deeds, bribed officials, and frightened struggling families into abandoning claims that later yielded fortunes beneath the earth. Those who resisted found mysterious fires consuming barns or livestock disappearing overnight. No accusation stood without proof. Folded carefully between the pages were copies of contracts, signed statements, and receipts bearing official county seals. Gideon had collected evidence for years, intending to expose the scheme publicly. Then one final passage stopped Evelyn's breath. "I fear I have waited too long. Men loyal to Bellamy, watch the saloon tonight. If I carry these papers openly, they will vanish before reaching the circuit judge. So I have hidden everything behind the eastern wall. The letters belong to families driven away by deceit. Some contain apologies. Others contain deeds returned to their rightful owners. A few hold keys to safety deposit boxes in Cedar Bluff, where compensation was quietly gathered from men whose consciences awakened too late. Should an honest soul discover this place after I am gone, I ask only one thing. Do not seek revenge. Seek restoration. Let Hollow Creek remember itself." Evelyn lowered the journal onto her lap. Outside, the valley glowed beneath the final light of evening, while swallows circled above the church steeple. She understood now why the farewell letters had never been delivered. Gideon had hidden them before he could finish his work. Whether illness, murder, or simple misfortune had claimed him, his final wish remained unfinished for more than 3 decades. She carefully examined the remaining contents of the cedar chest. Beneath a false bottom, she discovered a rolled survey map showing every original property boundary in Hollow Creek before Bellamy's acquisitions. Small handwritten notes identified wells, orchards, grazing fields, and forgotten family cemeteries now believed lost. Wrapped inside oilcloth rested a cloth pouch containing dozens of brass keys, each tagged with the name of a family and the number of a deposit box in Cedar Bluff Bank. She realized with growing astonishment that Gideon had quietly safeguarded not only evidence of injustice, but also the means to repair much of the damage. Yet she also understood the danger. Powerful families rarely welcomed old truths. If Alden Bellamy had inherited more than his grandfather's business, he might fight just as fiercely to keep the past buried. Evelyn returned every item to the chest, exactly as she had found it, except the journal, which she tucked carefully beneath her coat. Before closing the hidden chamber, she looked once more at the shelves lining the narrow room. They no longer appeared empty. They felt like silent witnesses who had waited patiently through decades of dust for someone willing to finish the task entrusted to them. As she swung the false wall closed, the mechanism clicked softly until the carved walnut blended once again with the surrounding panels, hiding every trace of the chamber's existence. The saloon seemed ordinary once more, yet nothing within it was ordinary now. The building had not merely sheltered forgotten memories. It had preserved a promise that time itself had failed to erase. Evelyn stood alone behind the old bar, the worn leather journal resting against her heart beneath her coat, and she realized that buying a neglected saloon for $4 had never truly been the beginning of her story. It had been the moment she unknowingly accepted responsibility for another person's final goodbye, and with it, the future of an entire town. The following morning dawned crisp and bright, but Evelyn knew that sunlight alone could not illuminate truths people had spent generations refusing to see. She carried Gideon's journal beneath her coat as she walked toward the church, believing that if anyone still remembered the old builder, it would be the oldest members of Hollow Creek. The white clapboard building stood quietly beneath towering cottonwoods, whose leaves shimmered in the breeze like countless tiny hands applauding the arrival of another day. Reverend Amos Keene was sweeping the front steps when he noticed her approaching. His beard had turned completely white, yet his back remained remarkably straight for a man who had witnessed nearly 7 decades of frontier life. He greeted her kindly, though curiosity lingered in his eyes. News traveled swiftly through small towns, and everyone already knew the stranger who had spent her last $4 on a collapsing saloon. Evelyn asked whether he had ever known a man named Gideon Mercer. The broom stopped moving. The old minister looked beyond her toward the distant saloon, as though searching for an answer, hidden somewhere between memory and regret. After several quiet moments, he nodded slowly. "He built half this town with his own hands," he said. "Then one day he disappeared without a farewell. His voice carried no certainty, only sadness polished smooth by many years. They sat together upon the church steps, while morning sunlight stretched across the empty street. Reverend Keene explained that Gideon had been respected by nearly everyone. He settled disputes without raising his voice, repaired broken roofs for widows who could never repay him, and insisted that children should never be turned away hungry regardless of their family name. Then, almost overnight, whispers began spreading that he had stolen money from investors and fled before facing justice. No evidence was ever shown publicly, but influential men repeated the accusations often enough that many accepted them as truth. Within months, his wife left town, believing herself abandoned. His name faded from conversation, and eventually only silence remained. Evelyn listened without interruption. When the minister finished speaking, she removed the leather journal from beneath her coat and placed it gently upon his lap. He stared at the familiar cover for several seconds before touching it with trembling fingers. His eyes filled with tears long before he reached the first page. He read quietly while the church bell marked the passing hour. At last he closed the journal and looked toward the mountains, unable to speak. "We wronged him," he whispered. "All these years, we wronged him." Evelyn told him about the hidden chamber, the letters, the deeds, the map, and the brass keys resting inside the cedar chest. She expected excitement. Instead, sorrow settled across the old minister's face. "Truth carries blessings," he said softly, "but it also awakens those who have profited from forgetting." Before noon, word somehow reached Alden Bellamy that strangers were asking questions about Gideon Mercer. The prosperous merchant arrived at the saloon that afternoon wearing a finely tailored black coat despite the summer warmth. His polished boots scarcely gathered dust as he climbed the porch. He smiled pleasantly enough, yet nothing about the smile reached his eyes. He congratulated Evelyn on purchasing the building and remarked that it had become little more than firewood after so many neglected years. Then his gaze drifted toward the freshly cleaned windows. "I hear you've been exploring," he said casually. Evelyn answered that old buildings often rewarded careful attention. Bellamy chuckled, though the sound carried no humor. "Careful attention sometimes uncovers old misunderstandings. Better left buried," he replied. "Folks around here have finally found peace. I'd hate to see needless stories stir unnecessary trouble." Evelyn met his gaze calmly. Peace built upon falsehood rarely remains peaceful. For the first time, his smile disappeared completely. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Some papers lose their value with age. Others become dangerous. If you discover anything unusual, I'd gladly purchase it from you, generously." Evelyn thanked him for the offer, but declined without hesitation. Bellamy tipped his hat politely and walked away. Yet before mounting his horse, he glanced once more toward the saloon with an expression that revealed more concern than confidence. We have often seen that guilty people recognize the approach of truth long before honest people realize they possess it. That evening, Reverend Keene returned carrying 3 elderly townsfolk who had known Gideon personally. Martha Ellison, whose hands still bore the roughness of 40 harvests, immediately recognized the handwriting upon one unopened envelope bearing her maiden name. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks before she even broke the faded seal. Inside rested a letter written by Gideon, explaining that her late father's farm had been stolen through forged documents, and that he had secured evidence proving the original deed remained valid. Folded beside the letter lay a brass key, tagged with a Cedar Bluff deposit number. Martha pressed the letter against her heart and wept without shame. Beside her, old Samuel Whitlock opened another envelope addressed to his parents. Inside, he found not money, but something even more precious: the original map showing the spring that once supplied his family's ranch before they had been driven away. One by one, forgotten names began returning to life through ink placed upon paper decades earlier by a man who believed goodness deserved patience. By lantern light, the small gathering filled the saloon with quiet conversation for the first time in more than 30 years. Laughter did not yet return, but hope did, and hope has always sounded remarkably similar when heard through the old wooden walls of places built to shelter ordinary people during extraordinary times. Within a week, the quiet meetings inside the old saloon became impossible to hide. Families who had long believed their grandparents abandoned Hollow Creek through failure discovered letters proving they had been victims of carefully planned deception. Elderly men who had carried shame since childhood now held documents restoring their parents' good names. Widows unfolded apologies written decades earlier by Gideon Mercer, each one expressing regret that justice had arrived too late for him to deliver in person. The forgotten building slowly transformed into a place where memories were mended, one conversation at a time. Fresh lanterns glowed each evening behind windows that had remained dark for generations, and for the first time in many years, music returned when young Caleb Morris repaired the old piano, replacing its missing ivory keys with carefully carved pieces of polished maple. The notes sounded imperfect, but perhaps perfection had never been the purpose. Hollow Creek needed healing more than flawless melodies. Alden Bellamy watched these changes with growing unease. His customers lingered less inside his general store because conversations had moved across the street into the restored saloon, where people shared family histories instead of merchandise. He soon realized that rumors alone would no longer protect the reputation his grandfather had built upon silence. One gray afternoon he arrived, accompanied by the county sheriff, and demanded to inspect the building, claiming reports of stolen property hidden inside. Sheriff Elias Turner appeared uncomfortable from the moment he stepped onto the porch. He had known Evelyn only briefly, yet everything about her conduct spoke of honesty. Still, the law required him to investigate the complaint. Evelyn welcomed both men inside without protest. She offered coffee brewed over the rebuilt stove and calmly explained every repair she had made since purchasing the property. Bellamy searched every room with barely concealed desperation, running his hands along walls, lifting rugs, opening cabinets, and peering beneath loose floorboards. The hidden chamber remained undiscovered because Evelyn had wisely returned every carving to its exact position after each visit. Frustration gradually replaced Bellamy's confidence. At last, he turned toward Evelyn. "You've been filling people's heads with old tales," he said sharply. "Dead men cannot defend lies written in forgotten journals." Evelyn looked toward Reverend Keene, who stood quietly beside the fireplace holding Gideon's leather book. "No," she answered gently. "But truth has a remarkable way of defending itself." The minister stepped forward and handed the journal to Sheriff Turner. Inside were notarized affidavits, signed land transfers, banking receipts, survey records, and correspondence bearing official county seals that no amount of denial could dismiss. The sheriff spent nearly an hour reading through the documents in complete silence. By the time he finished, his expression had changed entirely. He removed his hat slowly and looked toward Bellamy with unmistakable disappointment. "These records will need to be presented before the circuit court," he said. "If they're authentic, history in this town is about to change." Bellamy reached for the journal, but Turner closed it firmly before he could touch another page. The merchant left without another word, though everyone watching understood that his silence carried none of the confidence with which he had entered. Court proceedings followed several weeks later in Cedar Bluff. Witnesses arrived carrying Gideon's letters, original deeds, survey maps, and bank records retrieved using the brass keys hidden within the cedar chest. Descendants of families driven from Hollow Creek testified with quiet dignity rather than anger. They sought no revenge. They asked only that the truth be acknowledged and that property still held through fraudulent claims be returned wherever the law permitted. The judge listened patiently through 3 long days before issuing his decision. Several disputed parcels were restored to their rightful heirs. Compensation held untouched inside forgotten deposit boxes was released to surviving families. Most importantly, the court declared Gideon Mercer innocent of every accusation that had stained his name for more than 30 years. News of the ruling spread across the valley faster than spring rain. People gathered outside the little church where Reverend Keene read the judgment aloud, while the church bell rang longer than anyone could remember. There were no cheers of triumph, only quiet tears and grateful embraces. Evelyn stood near the edge of the crowd, content to remain unnoticed. She had never considered the discovery her achievement. She had merely opened a door another honest soul had built long before she arrived. During the months that followed, Hollow Creek slowly awakened. Families returned to restore abandoned homes, once believed permanently lost. The neglected school reopened with twice as many children. The old blacksmith shop filled again with the ringing rhythm of hammer against iron. Orchard trees hidden beneath years of neglect were carefully pruned until they bloomed once more. The saloon itself became something entirely different from what it had once been. The bar remained as a reminder of its history, but the room filled instead with long wooden tables where neighbors shared meals, Travelers found shelter, children learned to read during winter evenings, and town meetings ended with songs instead of arguments. Above the fireplace, Evelyn placed a small carved plaque bearing only 7 simple words. Truth waits patiently for honest hands to find it. Years later, visitors passing through Hollow Creek often asked how such a small frontier town had survived hardships that destroyed so many others. The townspeople never began by speaking of silver, courtrooms, or hidden chambers. They spoke first of a woman who arrived with only $4, purchased a neglected saloon everyone else had abandoned, and chose restoration instead of riches when fortune finally rested within her reach. They spoke of Gideon Mercer, whose final goodbye became the beginning of another generation's hope, and they remembered that buildings, like people, sometimes appear broken only because no one has yet looked behind the walls where faith quietly waits. Thank you for spending this journey with us. If this story reminded you that forgotten places and overlooked people can still change the world, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What is one time you discovered unexpected value in something everyone else had given up on? If you enjoy heartfelt frontier stories filled with mystery, resilience, and hope, please like this video, subscribe to Berry Tales, and ring the bell so you never miss another story. Until our next journey together, stay kind, stay curious, and stay close.